Lily had heard all the stories about her office building's haunted past, but she never believed in ghosts. To her, the tales of mysterious shadows and strange sounds were just exaggerations, rumors to keep people entertained on their night shifts. So, when she was assigned to work late that Friday, she didn't give the haunted building a second thought. As midnight approached, she gathered her things and made her way to the elevator. The office was silent, the usual hustle and bustle of the day replaced by an eerie stillness. She pressed the down button and waited, tapping her foot impatiently. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, relieved to be heading home. The button for the ground floor was already glowing, which she thought was odd, but she shrugged it off and leaned against the wall, checking her phone. The door slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. Just as she settled in, the elevator jolted, and she stumbled, gripping the handrail for support. The numbers above the door started blinking, skipping floors in a strange pattern. 9, 11, 12. Then, the elevator came to a shuddering stop, and the display blinked. 13. Lily frowned. She knew for a fact that her building didn't have a 13th floor. Just like most older buildings, it was skipped due to superstition. She assumed it was a glitch, an odd display error. But before she could process it, the doors slid open. She was greeted by a dim, narrow hallway she had never seen before. It was lined with faded wallpaper and flickering lights that buzzed softly, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. She could feel a chill coming from the hallway, a cold so intense it sent shivers down her spine. Lily peered out, her instincts urging her to stay inside. But then, she saw something, a faint, familiar figure standing at the end of the hall. She squinted, trying to make it out. "Mom," she whispered. It was impossible. Her mother had passed away years ago. But the figure standing at the end of the hall looked just like her. Same brown hair, same gentle smile. The figure raised a hand, waving Lily over with a calm, inviting gesture. Without thinking, she took a step out of the elevator. The moment her foot touched the hallway floor, the doors slid shut behind her, and the familiar ding of the elevator disappeared. She turned, but the elevator was gone, replaced by a solid wall of peeling wallpaper. Panic set in as she frantically searched for a way back, pressing her hands against the wall where the elevator should have been. But it was solid, as if the elevator had never been there at all. Turning back to the hallway, she saw her mother's figure waiting, still beckoning. Despite the fear clawing at her, she felt compelled to follow, her feet moving almost against her will. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly against the bare floor. As she got closer, her mother's face became clearer, but there was something wrong. Her smile seemed stretched, too wide, and her eyes were dark and hollow, reflecting no light. Lily froze, realizing that this was not her mother. This was something else, something wearing her mother's face. She took a step back, but the figure took a step forward, matching her movements. Its face twisted, the mouth widening into an unnatural grin that stretched from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharp, shadowy teeth. Lily turned and ran, sprinting back down the hallway, desperate to find an exit. The lights flickered erratically, casting brief glimpses of strange figures in the shadows, faces she didn't recognize, but that somehow seemed to be watching her, tracking her every move. She reached the end of the hall and found a door, its paint peeling, the number 13 scratched into the wood. Without a second thought, she yanked it open and stumbled inside. The room was dark, filled with an eerie silence. She took a step forward, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow coming from a small, dusty window in the corner. But as she looked around, she realized the room was filled with mirrors, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, each one reflecting her terrified face. In each reflection, her expression was slightly different. In one, her mouth was open in a silent scream. In another, she was crying. In yet another, her eyes were wide and staring directly at her with an unsettling intensity. She turned to leave, but the door was gone, replaced by yet another mirror, showing her own frightened reflection staring back. "Lily," a voice whispered, echoing around her. She spun, trying to find the source, but all she saw were her reflections, each one starting to move on its own, out of sync with her actual movements. One reflection took a step forward, pressing its hand against the glass as if it were trying to reach through. Its eyes were dark, hollow, and its mouth curved into a twisted smile, the same smile she had seen on the figure in the hallway. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice soft but chilling. She backed away, her heart pounding, but every step she took was mirrored by the reflections surrounding her, each one reaching out, each one grinning with that same unnerving expression. She closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up, hoping this was just a nightmare. When she opened them, she was back in the elevator. The doors were open, and she was standing on the ground floor, surrounded by the familiar hum of the lobby. She let out a shaky breath, clutching her bag, her mind racing to make sense of what had happened. She glanced at the elevator panel, but the 13th button was gone, just as it should have been. As she stumbled out, she noticed something in her reflection in the lobby mirror, a faint, dark shape standing just behind her, smiling with hollow eyes. It was nearly midnight when Jack decided to leave the office. He had stayed late to finish up a project, and now the only sounds in the building were his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. As he reached the elevator, he noticed that the out-of-order sign, which had been there all week, was gone. "Finally fixed," he muttered, pressing the button. With a ding, the doors opened, and Jack stepped inside. The elevator had a strange, musty smell. It was the same smell you'd find in an old, forgotten basement, and he wrinkled his nose at the odor. He pressed the button for the ground floor, watching the doors slide shut, sealing him inside. The ride was smooth at first, but then, without warning, the elevator stopped abruptly between floors. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving Jack in total darkness. "Just great," he muttered, fumbling for his phone to use as a flashlight. But before he could turn it on, the elevator lights flickered back to life. Only now, something was different. The floor numbers above the doors were gone, replaced by old-fashioned buttons numbered from B1 to B13. He stared in confusion. His building only had 6 floors, and none of them had a basement. As he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if on its own. "Hello," he called out, hoping someone might hear him through the speaker. But the speaker crackled, and a strange voice replied. "Going down." The voice was low and scratchy, almost like a whisper, but it was laced with an eerie cheerfulness. Jack's heart pounded as he frantically pressed the ground floor button, but the elevator continued its descent. The numbers above the door flickered. B1, B2, B3. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop at B4, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Jack peered out, expecting to see some forgotten part of the building, maybe an old storage room. But instead, the space was shrouded in darkness. Only a single light flickered at the end of what looked like a narrow corridor. He thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping through the light. His pulse quickened, and he instinctively reached out to press the closed button. But before he could, the lights in the hallway flickered to reveal an eerie figure standing at the end, facing away from him. It was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd expect from a century-old photograph. The figure turned slowly, and Jack felt a chill wash over him. The face was blank, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to stare straight through him, as if it could see into his very soul. The figure raised a hand, curling its finger, beckoning him forward. "No way," Jack whispered, hammering the close button in a panic. The doors closed, sealing him back inside the elevator, and it continued its descent. B5, B6, B7. The musty smell grew stronger, mingling with something worse, a sharp, metallic scent, like old, dried blood. He covered his nose, trying not to gag, but the air felt thick and suffocating. He tried to call for help again, but the speaker only crackled with faint whispers, too soft to understand. B10, B11, B12. The elevator stopped once more, and the door slid open. This time, the hallway was brightly lit, and Jack could see rows of identical doors lining the walls. The numbers on the doors were scratched out, but each door had a small, smeared plaque next to it. He squinted, trying to make out the writing. Jack Stone. His own name was written on the plaque next to the first door, scrawled in something dark and sticky. His stomach twisted with fear as he stumbled back, pressing himself against the elevator wall. Just then, he heard a faint knock from the other side of the door, a soft, steady tapping, as if someone was waiting for him. Jack felt cold sweat on his brow. His hand hovered over the close button, but his fingers shook too much to press it. Before he could react, he heard the knock again, louder this time, echoing through the hall. He slammed the button, and the doors closed just as he heard something start to scratch against the metal from the outside. The elevator shuddered, and the lights flickered violently. He could hear heavy breathing, as if something or someone was right outside, whispering his name. The descent continued, faster now, the numbers flashing past as the elevator seemed to plummet. B13, B14, B15. Impossible, he muttered, his voice trembling. This can't be real. The elevator came to an abrupt halt at what seemed like the lowest floor, and the doors slid open one final time. He was greeted by a pitch-black abyss, a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. But deep within the shadows, he could just make out a faint glow, like the flicker of a dying candle. A soft, familiar voice echoed from the darkness, calling his name. Jack, it's time to come home. The voice was his mother's, a mother who had passed away years ago. His mind screamed at him to stay back, but something about the voice pulled him forward. Step by step, he edged closer to the doorway, almost hypnotized, until he was standing right on the threshold, peering into the blackness. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold air beyond. But as he did, a skeletal hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing his wrist with an icy grip. He gasped, trying to pull back, but the hand tightened, yanking him forward with inhuman strength. The last thing Jack saw was the elevator doors sliding shut in front of him, sealing him in darkness as the lights flickered and went out. The next morning, when the cleaning staff arrived, they found the elevator sitting at the ground floor, its doors open. But there was no sign of Jack. The only trace of him was a small plaque, smeared with dark red, on the floor where he'd last stood. It read, Jack Stone, B13. Sarah had always hated elevators. There was something unsettling about the small, enclosed space and the unnatural way it dropped you, floor by floor, through an abyss of steel. But tonight, she didn't have a choice. It was almost midnight, and she was the last one to leave the office. The whole building was eerily silent, with only the dim emergency lights illuminating the long, empty hallway. When she reached the elevator, she hesitated. But the stairwell door was locked after hours, and she didn't have a key. With a sigh, she pressed the down button. The elevator arrived with a faint ding, and she stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead as the doors slid shut, and she pressed the button for the ground floor. As the elevator began its descent, it stopped at the 10th floor, even though Sarah knew she was the only person left in the building. The doors opened with a hollow chime. She peered out, expecting to see an empty hallway. But the corridor was pitch black, with no lights at all, and it seemed to stretch on impossibly far, fading into shadows. Just as she was about to press the close button, she noticed movement in the darkness. A figure was standing at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. She could only make out its silhouette, a tall, gaunt shape with long arms hanging unnaturally at its sides. It didn't move, but somehow, Sarah felt it was staring at her. Panic surged, and she hit the close button frantically. The door slid shut, and the elevator continued its descent. But her relief was short-lived. The elevator shuddered, then lurched to a stop at the 7th floor. This time, when the doors opened, the hallway was dimly lit, but empty. The air was cold, and a faint smell of decay wafted into the elevator. She shivered, feeling as if unseen eyes were watching her from the shadows. Suddenly, she heard a soft whisper, almost like a faint sigh. It echoed through the hallway, growing louder, closer. Sarah? Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone she was working late, and she certainly hadn't given anyone her name. Her hands shook as she pressed the close button again, this time jabbing it repeatedly. The doors closed, sealing her inside once more. But instead of going down, the elevator jolted violently and shot up, passing the floors at an alarming speed. She watched in horror as the numbers on the display climbed higher and higher, reaching the 30th floor, the 40th. She didn't even know the building had that many floors. The elevator finally stopped with a heavy clunk, and the lights flickered out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, desperate for any source of light, but it was dead. Her heart pounded as she stood in the pitch-black silence, trapped. A soft scraping sound echoed from somewhere above her, followed by a low, rasping breath. It was coming closer, descending from the darkness. Then, she heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the ceiling of the elevator, right above her head.
Once. Twice.
In the silence, a deep, raspy voice whispered, "Going down?" The elevator dropped suddenly, sending her stomach lurching. It was as if the entire cab was free-falling, plummeting through the floors at an impossible speed. The sound of metal scraping against metal screamed around her, and she clung to the handrail, helpless. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the descent stopped with a bone-jarring halt. The door slid open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway she didn't recognize. There was no sign of the lobby, just an endless corridor stretching out before her, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. At the far end of the hallway, the shadowy figure waited, silent and motionless, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. It lifted one skeletal hand, pointing straight at her. Behind her, the elevator doors began to close, trapping her in the hallway with the figure. She turned, trying to pry them open, but it was too late. The doors sealed shut, leaving her in total silence. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and measured, growing closer and closer. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and her breaths came in short, panicked gasps. Then, as the figure reached her, everything went dark. The next morning, the security guards found the elevator empty, stalled between floors. There was no sign of Sarah, and her phone lay on the floor, still dead. They searched every floor, every hallway, but she was gone. Weeks later, employees began reporting strange occurrences. Sometimes, late at night, the elevator would stop at random floors, the doors opening to reveal nothing but darkness. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you could hear a faint whisper drifting through the silence, calling out Sarah's name. It was said that if you rode the elevator alone after midnight, you might catch a glimpse of her shadow in the hallway, standing at the end, waiting, reaching out as if to pull you into the darkness with her forever.